Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Habiba Ali. I am honored to be your moderator for this important event. As the CEO of Society Renewable Energies and someone who is deeply involved in the renewable energy sector for the past few years, I am truly excited and thrilled to see such a diverse group of stakeholders gathered here today. A very warm welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the African Policy Research Institute. The event will discuss the critical role of the private sector in transforming Africa's energy landscape. As Africa possesses a wealth of untapped renewable energy resources, the potential for sustainable energy development is immense. However, millions of people across the continent still lack access to reliable electricity. This hampers, as you know, economic growth and development. Before I go any further, I would like to make one logistical announcement, and then I'll introduce the theme of the webinar, the program, and our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on APRI, the African Policy Research Institute's website, within a few days. After the presentation and panel discussions, we will be having a Q&A session. I would urge participants to prepare your questions as our experts are discussing, and we will post the questions in the chat box. Please indicate to whom your question is addressed. I will do my best to get them through to our panelists in time that we have for the Q&A. So as a form of introduction, we're here today to have an open conversation with thought experts in the renewable energy sector. This webinar will provide a comprehensive overview of Africa's renewable energy landscape, highlighting its potential, the current development status, in spite of the rich availability of solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal resources. Africa has some of the lowest electricity access rates, as we all know, and this is one of the things that holds us back globally. The transition to renewable energy is not only an environmental and a necessity, but it's also for us in Africa, it is a strategic move to address energy poverty and align with global climate goals, while also improving upon poverty levels as well. By reducing dependency on fossil fuels, we can in Africa mitigate the risks associated with volatile prices and geopolitical tensions, fostering a more stable and sustainable energy future. One of the key focus of the webinar is going to be to examine the critical role of the private sector in driving renewable energy projects and investments. As we all know, where there is no private sector, there is no development or growth. The private sector's involvement is essential for overcoming the limitations often faced by public utilities and government-led initiatives. Private enterprises bring innovation, investment, and efficient project management capabilities, which are crucial for scaling up renewable energy deployment. Moreover, the private sector can significantly contribute to job creation, local industry development, and enhancing energy security across the continent. I would add here that it will also, ensure gender balance is achieved. You see, I'm a woman. Despite the opportunities, significant barriers impede private sector involvement in the renewable energy sector in Africa. Financial constraints, regulatory hurdles, infrastructure deficits, and market risks are among the major challenges that need to be addressed. This webinar aims to discuss actionable strategies, share best practices. Insights will be drawn from a recent policy brief by the African Policy Research Institute. The objective of the webinar vary. It seeks to provide a detailed overview of the renewable energy landscape in Africa. It will emphasize its potential and current status. It will also identify and discuss the key challenges faced by the private sector, including financial constraints, regulatory hurdles, and infrastructure deficits. Successful case studies of private sector engagement in renewable energy projects will be explored to showcase practical solutions and innovative approaches Finally, the webinar will propose policy recommendations and strategies to enhance private sector participation and foster a thriving renewable energy sector. Through this discussion, the webinar is aiming to pave the way for a more robust and dynamic renewable energy market in Africa by addressing the barriers and leveraging the strengths of the private sector. The continent can unlock its vast renewable energy potential, driving sustainable economic growth and improving the quality of life for millions of people. As a summary, Energizing Africa, enabling private sector development in renewable energies, is set to be a pivotal event that will shed light on the crucial role of the private sector in Africa's energy transition. It is bringing together experts. This webinar will facilitate a meaningful dialogue aimed at overcoming challenges and harnessing the full potential of renewable energy resources for a sustainable and prosperous Africa. Before we dive into the core discussion and have this discussion with the panelists, I will take time to briefly take you through the program for the next 90 minutes and introduce our panelists. The webinar consists of a presentation first, which is followed by a panel discussion, and then I will now go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Nnadozie Ifeanyiwaha, a distinguished energy and sustainability consultant with over 9 years of experience in the energy sector. He will be presenting the preliminary finding from the APRI study on the renewable energy landscape in Africa, focusing on the critical role of the private sector in driving renewable energy projects and investments. Mr. Nnadozie has an expertise that spans a wide range of areas, including regulatory and policy advisory, climate change, renewable energy, tariff design, financing models, business risk analysis, data analysis, and market research. As an associate director at Energy Markets and Rates Consultants, EMRC, he has consistently demonstrated his proficiency in financial analysis and modeling. Nnadozie's commitment to energy transition and climate change is evident through his involvement in supporting multi-million-dollar investments in renewable energy sources, designing climate impact and reporting programs, and then developing training programs to enhance climate awareness. I also have the pleasure to introduce two thought leaders from the sector. I hear Ayo is not here yet and will be represented by Chibuikem, but I will still introduce Ayo. Maybe he still joins us in a bit. He's Mr. Ayo Ademilua, the CEO of A4&T Power Solutions and the president of the Renewable Energy Association of Nigeria. He will, on this webinar, share insights on the challenges and opportunities in the renewable energy sector from his extensive experience. Mr. Ademilua is a seasoned professional in the renewable energy industry, and as the CEO of A4&T Power Solutions, he has spearheaded numerous projects aimed at enhancing energy access and sustainability across Nigeria. When Mr. Ademilua joins us, I will finish off his very extensive profile. Chibuikem, you do me the favor, if you are then speaking representing Ayo, you will give me a bit of your profile to introduce you just before you speak. Yeah?
Sure.
Okay. Our next speaker is Mr. Najim Animashaun, a highly experienced professional in the renewable energy sector. A non-resident fellow he is a non-resident fellow at the African Policy Research Institute, APRI, where he focuses on the political economy of energy. With over 30 years of experience as a legal and regulatory advisor, Najim has a wealth of knowledge in the energy sector. He is also actively involved in developing renewable energy projects in Nigeria and West Africa, contributing to the growth and sustainability of the region's energy infrastructure. I will now take the pleasure to pass the floor to Mr. Nnadozie so that he can go ahead with his presentation. Mr. Nnadozie, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Abiba, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I will try to run us very quickly through a presentation on enabling private sector development in renewable energy. So it's just a few slides where we'll talk about key findings from a policy brief that was developed by APRI. And here we'll discuss basically the renewable energy landscape across Africa, private sector involvement, some government initiatives, some strategies, recommendations, and also policy recommendations. So I would be jumping right into it as we proceed. So first, we'll be looking at Africa's renewable energy landscape. So Africa's renewable energy landscape presents a paradox of vast untapped renewable energy resources. However, despite being rich in multiple resources like solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal energy sources, the continent still has one of the lowest electricity access rates globally, with about 600 million people living without any power supply. This underscores a critical need for transformative energy solutions that are sustainable, accessible, and scalable. Moving forward, when we look at in terms of the renewable energy sources that we have in Africa, you will see that they account for less than 20% of Africa's electricity generation, showing Africa's heavy dependence on fossil fuel sources. So if you look to the right side of the slide, you would see where we have discussed the solar potentials for each energy source. So you have solar having 10 terawatts, you have wind having 350 gigawatts, you have geothermal having 15 gigawatts, and you have hydro having 1,750 terawatts potential. So what this shows us is Africa is sitting on vast untapped renewable energy sources that have the potential to pretty much light the continent and beyond the continent, because I mean we have started to tap some of that potential from our hydro sources, but we could see that there's still a long way to go. I believe if we take Nigeria as an example, Nigeria has about just over 1,000 megawatts of hydro generation supplying the national grid, which today makes up for just under 20% as well, similar to what Africa has as its total electricity generation. So looking at this, we can see that Africa is poised to pretty much provide all its electricity needs from its renewable energy sources. And then now on this next graph, what we're looking at is we're seeing the installed renewable energy based generation capacity and how it has moved from 2011 to 2020. And from what you can see here, you can see that we started from below 30 gigawatts in 2011, and today we're at almost 60 gigawatts. And if you look to the right, you will see the contribution of each of these basically solar energy sources, with the renewable energy sources, with solar leading the charge with 48% of the total energy, the renewable energy based generation in Africa. So solar has 48%, hydropower 24%, wind 28%. And based on what we saw on the previous slide, where we had over 1,750 terawatts hydro potential, I would say we still have there's still room for growth for hydro energy sources to come in. Then now we look at renewable energy performance across Africa. So across North, West, East, Central, and South Africa, to just get a sense of what is happening in the renewable energy space in each of these regions. So in North Africa, you have countries like Morocco and Egypt that are leading the solar energy charge with ambitious projects like the Noor Kwazat solar complex in Morocco, one of the world's largest solar power plants. North Africa's proximity to Europe also offers for potential for energy exports. So basically, as we continue to close our own internal energy access gap in Africa, we can already see that there's also the potential to not just close that gap, but also become an exporter of that renewable energy to other continents across. In West Africa, the region has made strides in both solar and wind energy. Nigeria is gradually exploring solar energy to address its power shortages. It has projects like the Nigeria Electrification Program in its second phase, which is promoting off-grid solar solutions. So in the first phase, you had a combined funding of $750 million from both the World Bank and the AFDB. And in the second phase of the DARES program, which is the NEP2, you have a funding source of $750 million already committed from the World Bank, with other parties like AFDB and other development partners looking to make commitments in that as well. You have Senegal implementing projects like the Boko Solar Park to diversify its energy mix. Also, you have in East Africa, this is a region that's a leader in geothermal energy, with Kenya being the largest producer of geothermal energy in Africa. Ethiopia is also making strides in geothermal development with projects like the Aluto Langano geothermal plant. Wind energy is also gaining traction, especially in Kenya, where you have the Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya, which is the biggest wind power project in Africa to date. So then we move over to Central Africa. While this region has remained the least developed in terms of renewable energy, you find countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo having significant untapped hydropower potential, particularly with the Congo River. So projects such as the Inga Dam could drastically increase the region's renewable energy capacity. So lastly, we have South Africa. They are the forefront of wind energy development as well, and wind and solar, and actively expanding their solar energy capacity. A notable example is South Africa's Just Energy Transition Plan, JETP, announced at COP26, which involves 8.5 billion in funding from international partners to accelerate the transition from coal to renewable energy. So what we can see across all the regions in Africa is that every region is trying not to be left behind and is actively putting out initiatives and projects to scale their renewable energy sources. So now we look at the African population that's being served by renewable energy. And as well, we can see a growth in the population that has been served from 2009 all the way to 2019. So in that space, you could see how basically we've gone from less than 2 million people being supplied by renewable energy sources to having now almost 60 million people as of 2019. And this number has significantly also increased between 2019 to date. However, we've provided this information based on the available data that we have. So we can see that solar light is still a key driver in terms of serving the population. And this is because beyond when you talk about having solar panels to power your homes, a lot of our streets these days are being powered by solar street lights, and you also have solar lanterns and other solar lighting technologies that are out there. So now we look at the role of private sector in renewable energy. So we've tried to group this private sector into basically 4 key roles that we see them fitting into. So one is being private solar companies and developers, being technology providers, being financiers and investors, and also being project management and consultancy firms. So under them being private solar companies and developers, basically we have solar companies being at the forefront of deploying different types of solar energy solutions across Africa. You have companies like the M-Copper, D-Light, and B-Box that have been instrumental in providing off-grid solar solutions to millions of households. M-Copper alone has connected over 1 million homes in East Africa to affordable solar power. As technology drivers, you have private companies basically leading the charge when it comes to renewable energy technologies in Africa and helping to modernize the energy infrastructure in the continent. So you look at private companies like Siemens and General Electric that supply wind turbines and solar panels for large-scale renewable energy projects, ensuring the use of cutting-edge technology. I think it's important to note that some of these private companies that are leading the charge on this technological initiatives are also providing services across the entire on-grid and off-grid space of the electricity market. So you also have companies as financiers and investors. So financial institutions and investors play a crucial role by providing the necessary capital for renewable energy projects. The AFDB and private equity firms like Actis and Berkeley Energy have heavily invested in renewable energy projects across Africa. And according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, private sector investment today accounts for approximately 70% of all renewable energy investments in Africa, which is quite significant when you think about it. And lastly, we see the private sector also playing a key role as being project management and consultancy firms. So you have firms specializing in project management and consultancies such as McKinsey and Company, Cross Boundary, and PwC, who provide strategic guidance and manage the implementation of renewable energy projects. These firms bring global best practices and efficient management techniques to African renewable energy sector. And why firms like this are very important in driving the charge for private sector is they basically, these are firms who are operating in multiple continents and carrying out the same initiatives but employing it under various business models. So we're able to benefit from their understanding of international best practice and then bringing it here. Not to say we don't have a lot of local renewable energy firms that are also leading the charge on project management and consultancy support. Next, we look at some of the roles and impacts that we've had. So this is just going to still mention in terms of the investment technologies, technology transfer, and project management. So we're just looking at some of the examples of how private sector has led the charge. So you have the Lake Turner Wind Power Project in Kenya, which is the largest single private investment in Kenya's history, which cost around $680 million. And that is quite a significant investment when you think about it for an energy project, especially in a continent like Africa that has only received to date about 55 billion of renewable energy investments in the last 2 decades. You also have private companies like Bbox who have introduced affordable solar systems that use pay-as-you-go models, making solar energy accessible to low-income households. And of course, this innovative technologies and business models that are being introduced by Bbox also help to basically allow more access for consumers to come into the renewable energy space. So by helping to reduce the upfront cost of getting that access and providing pay-as-you-go models instead. You have efficient project management. So you have private enterprises enhancing efficiency and expertise in renewable energy projects by collaborating with governments and international agencies. As well, referring to the Lake Turkana wind project in Kenya, Africa's largest wind projects as well, with over 310 megawatts, with a capacity of 310 megawatts. It shows, successful project management through such partnerships and currently contributing 15% of Kenya's installed electricity capacity. Then you have global companies as well, like Siemens and GE, which have been earlier mentioned, being able to transfer some of their own their technologies and to support projects. So basically, based on lessons learned and best practice technologies that they have from international experience, and being able to transfer that to Africa's local space. Now we look at under the role of private sector in the renewable energy space, we look at some of the challenges that are being faced. So we've grouped it into 4 key major challenges, and those are financial constraints, regulatory hurdles, infrastructure deficits, and market risk. So under financial constraints, you have high upfront costs and limited access to affordable financing as major barriers to private sector investment in renewable energy. In Nigeria, the high cost of capital and lack of long-term financing options impede large-scale projects, while in Kenya, perceived risks also make securing affordable financing challenging for private investors. And, so in as much as the charge to moving to more renewable energy sources is underway in Africa, we still have a lot of the financing coming not in local currency and being gotten from foreign investors. So you also have, beyond the high costs risk, you still have that high volatility in the markets, which some of which falls under the market risk. Under the regulatory hurdles, you have unstable or unclear regulatory environments that deter investments. So you have countries like Tanzania and Nigeria with inconsistent policy implementation, creating uncertainty for investors and slowing renewable energy development. In Ghana, the evolving regulatory framework causes delays and complexities in project approvals. And I think some of the reasons why we see some delays in some of the implementations of regulations and policies is typically because in Africa, while we try to get a holistic, regulatory frameworks and policies, especially learning from case studies, international case studies, what you find is it's not always tailored to meet our local, basically what we have on ground locally. So when we take some of these initiatives and turn them into regulations and policies, we should be able to look for how to make it bespoke to the local environments. Then you also have infrastructure deficits, inadequate infrastructure limit, inadequate grid infrastructure limits renewable energy integration. In Ethiopia and as well in Nigeria, the lack of transmission infrastructure hinders connecting projects to the national grid. In South Africa, existing grid infrastructure can often handle additional capacity from new projects, cannot handle additional capacity from new projects. I think why it's very important here to talk about the infrastructure deficits, especially when it comes to the grid, is for us to fully achieve universal access, there has to be a way where there's some sort of marriage between being able to integrate all these renewable energy sources into the grid. And then when you have countries like Nigeria that have unstable transmission grids that are unable to provide adequate supply for its current installed capacity, it already makes it difficult to be able to integrate even more energy into the grid. And then you have, for market risks, you have political instability, currency fluctuations, policy changes, and all which pose significant risk. In Zimbabwe, the political and economic challenges create a high risk environment for investments. And this is because you stand the chance of having implemented regulations and also policies being basically revoked or changed in the blink of an eye. In countries like Egypt, you have currency fluctuations and economic reforms that impact the financial viability of projects, deterring private sector participations. So these are some of the key issues, how we've been able to group them as key challenges being faced by the private sector and their increased participation in the renewable energy space. So now we look at some of the opportunities. Some of the opportunities are the growing demand of the renewable in basically the need to close the energy access gap. So in as much as we've seen initiatives coming into this energy space, what you still find is that there's still a growing demand and renewable energy is able to close that gap. You have, of course, with private sector leading the charge. You have technological advancements. So advancements in renewable energy technologies such as solar PV, wind turbines, and energy storage that are making the systems more efficient and affordable. And the decreasing cost of solar PV and exemplified by Kenya's Strathmore Energy Research Center now open new investment opportunities. And I think, as we mentioned, the decreasing cost of solar PV, I believe, according to IRENA, today we have the levelized cost of energy as of 2023 being less than 50 cents per kilowatt hour. And of course, there's been increased support by international climate. So you have global sustainability commitments like the Paris Agreement, which is driving increased investment in renewable energy. You have countries like Nigeria who have proposed to go completely green by the year 2060. Also, you have there's opportunities for public-private partnerships. PPPs offer collaboration opportunities, leveraging resources and expertise to develop large-scale projects. Governments provide regulatory support and infrastructure, while private companies provide investments and technical skills. You have an example of Nigeria's Azura Edo Power project, which exemplifies the success of PPP in overcoming barriers and delivering significant energy capacity. Okay, now we're just going to quickly look at two case studies of private sector involvement in big major renewable energy projects in Africa. So you have the Lake Turner Wind Power Project. It's a 310 megawatt capacity project that was developed by a consortium of private investors. And the project is a prime example of successful private sector engagement in renewable energy. So what's the private sector involvement was the project was developed by a consortium, including KP and P Africa PV, Outreach International Investors. Of course, they had backing from the likes of the African Development Bank. Key challenges that we overcome was there was a logistical challenge due to the remote location and the need for significant infrastructure development, which included basically developing a 428 kilometer transmission line to connect the wind farm to the national grid. Um, Key success and impact is that this the LTWP supplies approximately 15% of Kenya's electricity demand, and significantly boosting the country's renewable energy capacity. This case demonstrates the importance of PPPs, like I had mentioned, in terms of the Azura Edo. While Azura Edo was an on-grid initiative, projects like the Lake Turkana Wind project is an off-grid key initiative that's happened in Africa. On the next slide, we just have a snapshot of the Lake Turkana Wind Power Project and basically what it looks like and what they were able to achieve. The next project we're going to look at is Morocco's Nor Kwazat, forgive my pronunciation, Morocco's Nor Kwazat Solar Complex.
It's Ouarzazate.
Ouarzazate Solar Complex. Thank you very much, Najee. So this complex in Morocco is the world's largest concentrated solar power plant with substantial private sector involvement, illustrating as well the successful PPP initiatives. So what you have in terms of private sector involvement, you have several companies, including Aqua Power, which played a crucial role in development and financing of the plant. As well, you have some recurring names like the World Bank and the African Development Bank providing providing financing support. So the project had to address an issue which related to its financing. It had an estimated initial cost of around $9 billion. And technological integration, like the integration of thermal energy storage systems and scaling up concentrated power technology, these were challenges that he faced as at the time. These were still relatively new technologies. Its impact is it has a total of 580 megawatts and provides a significant portion of Morocco's energy needs, helping the country achieve its renewable energy targets and reduce its carbon footprint. So next, it was just what we're looking at is a snapshot of what this solar plant looks like. And as you can see, I don't think we have anything like this anywhere else in the world. So next, we're just going to quickly look at some policy instruments that can be used to basically drive renewable energy sectors development. So you have policy instruments. We have about 11 of them. You have feed-in tariffs, renewable portfolio standards, mini-grid policies, power purchase agreements, tax incentives and subsidies, renewable energy targets, eligible customer regulations, tariff orders mandating renewable energy integration, net metering, carbon pricing, and green bonds. So I'm just going to pick on the of this and discuss some of these policy instruments. So you have things like tariff orders mandating renewable energy integration. And I'm picking on this because it's the most recent one out of Africa in terms of it comes out of Nigeria, where NERC has requested that the distribution companies in the country are now mandated to procure 5% of the additional vested capacities from renewable energy sources by 2025. So what this means is for a distribution company that has a capacity of 600 megawatts, you're now going to be required to procure an additional 30 megawatts of that from renewable energy sources. And then this is a very good initiative because it brings about a handshake between the on-grid and off-grid sector. And now, kind of basically being able to bypass the weak transmission grid and to integrate this renewable energy source directly into the distribution network to serve customers within the environment. And you have mini grid policies, which are fantastic policies that have been driving the development of mini grids for off-grid and last mile communities. I think why these are very mini grid policies are important is if designed and applied properly, they stand a chance to closing significantly the energy gap that we have. And I'll use an example as Kenya's mini grid policy, which was released in 2021. A key snippet from it, which was added, and I think is everyone can learn from it. You are required to provide a feasibility study which shows how that mini grid can eventually integrate into the national grid. So basically, there's a plan to be able to eventually marry what's going on the off-grid space with the on-grid space, and being able to take that power, beyond just serving people in the immediate environs, but being able to get them, to even further areas. So I think that's a very interesting initiative. Also, you have the net metering. So net metering is supposed to allow for bidirectional buying and selling of power between so you have consumers not just being consumers, but also being prosumers, because they have the ability to sell back to the grid. This is still very, 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 I would say, in early stages across Africa, because I know a lot of countries are still in the development phase of their net metering policies. But you have countries like US, Canada, Germany, Australia, and also India that have been able to basically implement their net metering policies, and the aggregating power and being able to send it back to the national, not just to the grid. So being able to sell back, not just you consuming, but being able to sell back your excess. So basically, we've mentioned 11 of these policies. So running through, we're going to talk about some financing mechanisms being employed to support renewable energy projects in Africa. You have development finance institutions. So I have mentioned the African Development Bank and the World Bank multiple times in this entire presentation, where I've talked about how they have been able to step into back projects that have happened, like the one in Morocco, the No Kwazat, basically solar project, and also being able to fund the Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya as well. I've discussed extensively the impact of public-private partnerships, which has really been driving initiatives in the electricity sector and also in the renewable energy space. You have crowdfunding and microfinancing, blended finance instruments, carbon credits, local pension funds. There's conversation today, especially in Nigeria, talking about how local pension funds can be used to basically finance power projects as well. So we have listed comprehensively some of these financing mechanisms. And what we're just showing in this next slide is a snapshot of how renewable energy investments have grown in Africa. Compared to how it has grown globally, is still significantly small, because renewable energy investments at 2020 still represent less than 2% of global investments. So, but however, if you look at the absolute numbers, you have renewable energy investments moving from 4.8 billion US dollars in the year 2000 all the way to 55 billion US dollars by 2020. Yes, still significantly small, but however, in terms of the absolute numbers, it's been an increment, and we hope to see more in the coming years. So I had earlier mentioned that Central Africa was lagging behind in basically its renewable energy initiatives compared to other regions across Africa. And I believe from this graph, from this table, you can see that the numbers actually don't lie, because you have Central Africa being at zero in 2000, the year 2000, and still being at barely 1.3 billion USD. While its counterpart, South Africa, who was at 0.3 billion, has been able to move all the way to over 20 billion at the end of this period. So now we look at Nigeria's energy sector, and basically as a case study to see how renewable energy can come into, and the private sector, not just renewable energy. So the private sector can drive renewable energy initiatives to close the gap we have in Nigeria. So from what we can see that energy generated as at 2022 by Nigeria was, in the total year, we used the capacity of just 3,645 megawatts by the time you convert the energy generated to the available capacity. And this is basically, this is quite poor compared to the on-grid installed capacity of 13,000 megawatts. So what this shows is that there's still a lot of room for the private sector to come into the electricity space and close the gap. And this is not to say the private sector has not already made significant strides in that space, but just to mention that there's still a lot of room that can be filled by private sector initiatives. And of course, this is being led by charges like off-grid initiatives through REA, which I had mentioned, the Nigeria Electrification Program, the NEP, which to date has, is implementing funds of over $1 billion to drive off-grid initiative to last mile, communities and to close the energy access gap today, which stands at over 40%. So what this slide is really showing is that it's showing what the renewable energy potential and opportunity is, because there's a potential for 427,000 megawatts of renewable energy to come from solar and 24,000 megawatts to come from hydro. So this shows basically there's a long way to go in terms of being able to unlock all this renewable energy potential, and the private sector is well poised to drive the unlocking of these initiatives. And just to put things in more perspective, we have today we have an existing installed grid capacity of 13,000 megawatts. But however, the load demand that has been estimated for Nigeria in 2020 was just under 18,000 megawatts, and currently we are barely meeting 5,000. We average between 4,000 to 4,500 megawatts of that. So this shows that in terms of the load that is required to close out this energy access gap, there's still a lot of potential for the private sector to come in and drive that opportunity, because you have over 10,000 megawatts of supply that is up for grabs and most likely being augmented by captive diesel generators. So in Nigeria, we're just going to look at some of the government and private sector efforts. So the power sector privatization happened in 2013, with the government looking to basically bring the private sector to come and play in the electricity market space. So what we can see by this is the government has always believed that the private sector has and can play an important role in getting us in solving the energy challenges that we have, in Nigeria and also Africa as a whole. So what you find is the first step was privatizing the on-grid space of the electricity sector. But today you also have REA driving key initiatives on the off-grid side. And now you have even the regulator of the entire market imposing renewable energy obligations to the on-grid counterparts to ensure that there's an alignment with all strategies going on. You also have renewable energy initiatives like the NEP, which I've mentioned. So under NEP, you have things like Energizing education, which looks to energize the 37 federal universities, teaching hospitals, and also primary healthcare centers. You have policy frameworks that have been fantastic in trying to drive renewable energy integration. Key frameworks like the mini grid regulation, franchising, the Electricity Act. The Electricity Act is very heavy on the integration of renewable energy into the national grid. Then you have investment in infrastructure, where you see that the government is trying to basically beef up the capacity of the basically the network in the country to allow it to be able to also not just serve the on-grid customers, but also be able to integrate renewable energy into the grid. So here, just quickly skimming through, we're looking at some of the incentives that you have for renewable energy companies. Of course, this which is bordering strongly on private sector. So these are some of the things that are driving improved private sector participation in the renewable energy sector. You have things like 100% withholding tax on interest for foreign loans with a minimum 7-year tenure and 2-year grace period. And why this is very important is, yes, we have seen strides in local financing coming into the renewable energy space, but a lot of the financing and funding still comes from the international market. You have things like tax holidays. You have 3-year investment tax relief. So it's there's a lot of incentives going on, which we're expecting to see more under the state, basically state regulations, states' participation in the electricity market. Because what you would then have is the states can now design their own incentives for renewable energy companies to come in. So some of the strategies for enhancing private sector participation, you have policy consistency and investor confidence. So basically just ensuring that policies are stable and beyond being stable, are robust for the local market as well. So that would, boost investor confidence. You have South Africa as an example that's attracted over 14 billion investments, due to stable policies and long-term PPAs. Diversified financing instruments, looking at the crowdfunding and DFIs, and as well bringing in green bonds. You have Nigerian sovereign green bond, which has generated over $60 million in green bonds by the Nigerian Sovereign Authority. You have robust infrastructure development, so basically working on the current infrastructure to allow for improved integration for renewable energy. You also have public-private synergy. We've seen a lot of PPPs driving key projects across Africa. So, of course, we're still looking at this as a key strategy to keep moving forward. Then, for policy recommendations, we're looking at things like fiscal incentives and regulatory support. So, fiscal incentives, where we had pretty much discussed tax holidays and tax breaks for renewable energy companies, and regulatory support, where you're seeing the likes of NERC now mandating renewable energy purchase obligations to the distribution companies. You have capacity building and knowledge transfer. So to expanding financing options, green bonds and crowdfunding. Okay, so capacity building and knowledge transfer, you have the likes of the Energy Training Center, which is very, very versed in providing capacity building training. So Energy Training Center doesn't just provide theoretical capacity building, they actually provide practical capacity building as well in the sector for the renewable energy space. You have R&D and technological innovation. Then you have market facilitation and information dissemination. So collaborative efforts between government and private sectors can leverage resources, share risk and accelerate project implementation. And that comes to the end of the findings on the policy brief. I hope you have been able to pick up on a thing or two or three, which would help you understand, the private sector's involvement in the renewable energy space and their contribution so far over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nadozie, for your very deep and insightful presentation. I hope everybody, just like me, got a bit of the new learning from this discussion. It was really insightful for me because so many things that are fresh, I got to learn. Thank you again very much, Mr. Nadozie. Now we will go on to the panel discussion, and actually it should go to Mr. Ayo Ademilua, but I believe he's still not here. So we're fully going to work with Mr. Chibuikem, who is currently on the call. And Mr. Chibuikem is our next speaker then, essentially. And he's a climate and energy specialist with over 12 years of experience in sub-Saharan Africa's energy market. His expertise includes low carbon electrification, energy nexus, climate transition, and the circular economy. He is well versed in policy and regulatory reform, political economy, market development, climate finance, and rural economics. Mr. Chibuikem, I hope you are okay to be the first to start the discussion for us this morning. I will go straight into asking you the first question, and which goes as, so there's been a lot of discussion about private sector and how we will be the ones that will, the kind of support we'll give to the climate energy transition sector of the policies that are being made across Africa. So I would like to ask you, if private sector investment in renewable energy resources development proves essential or desirable to meet a country's urban or rural electric policy goals, does the domestic economic, legal, and regulatory regime create a level playing field for renewable energy technologies currently as is?
Thank you very much, Habiba. Please confirm that you can hear me very well.
Yeah, you're good.
Great. Thank you so much, Habiba. Thanks a lot, Nadozi, as well for that. I'm just going to build on your presentation as well and just dive into the question. So I think during your presentation, you really touched on several policies, regulations, looking at the enabling environment in Africa for enabling technologies. And I think one of the key things is there have been significant improvement in terms of the policy or the enabling environment landscape in Africa for renewables. A lot of this has been driven by global climate commitments and a lot around the net zero and energy transition. A lot has also been with regards to seeing how to utilize renewable energy sources towards meeting some of our developmental goals, particularly when it comes to electrification, and several other drivers. I think in a nutshell, there has been, I think one of the things that Africa has, and maybe even more specifically to Nigeria, is really a good number of policies, legislation, and legislation basically, and policy documents, regulations towards renewable energy. I think over time, a lot of them have been developed, and that have also attracted significant private sector investment. So I think in Africa broadly, we don't have, the core issues which are the policy provisions is not the issue. However, in terms of gaps, one of the key areas there is really around implementation. So I think it's one thing to be able to develop policies, and it's another to be able to implement them. And so over time, we've seen things around renewable energy policies, some of the climate commitments to the NDC. Several African countries have developed their energy transition plan with very huge, ambitious targets. And some of them have put in place, measures either through from support from DFIs or from donors towards that. But we still have issues with regards to implementation and policy consistency in some areas, and particularly embedding some of the renewable energy policies across the economic sectors, the economic sectors. So, for example, how do you integrate renewable energy, or how do you mainstream climate into the development plans in the agriculture sector, in the health sector, in the education sector as well. Just to summarize on that, I think broadly we've seen significant progress in terms of the policy and regulatory landscape, and that has catalyzed a lot of the investment that Nadozi has spoken to, even though globally that's still less than 2%. Still, a lot of progress needs to be done in terms of implementing these policies and also localizing them down at the sub-national or sub-county level, depending on the country, and also which would further stimulate in investor confidence, particularly with the evolving political landscape in African countries. So let me just pause there, but happy to take any specific questions that might arise from my response. Thank you, Habiba.
Okay, thank you very much, Chibuikem, and I agree with you that it is not a lack of policies that are the problem, or rather anything that we need to focus on currently, especially I know in Nigeria we have very robust policies already compared to, let's say, 15 years ago when I started in this sector. How much policies have evolved and what the specific policies relating to specific issues have actually come up. And I like the way you kind of captured that when we have the implementation part even marrying to the policy, this level playing field that we want for the renewable energy sector could actually be found. I will go and ask Mr. Nadozie here now that if you could just, I know you touched on it a bit while you were giving your presentation, but I would like to further ask if you can be very specific about the kind of barriers that you will say have been the reason that stunted the scale in Africa as much as we would want, to achieve. I know that we've grown, but I think it could be better, is what I'm saying here. And how do you propose value for the communities who use these technologies? And I'm coming here because we work a lot in the rural communities. So how can you marry the barriers and still talk about the value of it to the growth of communities in Africa?
Okay, thank you very much, Habiba. So I think, yes, I have touched on some of these barriers, but I would just still, go further to shed a little bit more light. So, the key things I had mentioned that were issues are the financial constraints, regulatory issues, infrastructure deficits, and other market risks. So for the financial constraints, it's still a huge challenge as well, because in today's Nigerian markets, we know how volatile the economic landscape is in terms of things like forex and inflation. So yeah, I'll give you an example. You basically go and seek financing today at an exchange rate of say 500 naira, or let me use last year, and then by the time you're getting to market, the market has moved ahead of you, and you're looking at your financials are looking very much different. And how do you factor in? Let's take for instance, you had even already gone ahead to sign a PPA with your off taker or your community. So you're going to have to sign a PP at a certain amount, let's say 500 naira to a dollar. And by the time you get into market and implementation, you're coming up with changes. And in terms of trying to implement now 1.5 high inflation, and of course, this will affect your entire business value chain in terms of things like your OPEX and the likes for running your plants, no matter how big or how small. So I think those are still issues that we have today, and what is very important is I think basically our local players in terms of the banking sector really needs to get very much more involved in what is happening in the private sector today, the renewable energy space. So you have companies like Sterling and Stanbic who have come up with robust renewable energy funding that are I think are being disbursed today. But I think it'll be very good for us to see more players coming in. And just to give an example as to why this is important, what had happened at the privatization of the basically electricity value chain should have been a very key lesson for us as to what's happening in the private sector. And what I mean by this is you had distribution and generation companies being sold in the US dollar back then, and they were sold at what 158 naira to the dollar. And then you had investors being unable to pay back the acquisition loans. You had banks taking over these companies. You had NERC basically coming in with regulatory interventions because they could not operate. Yes, largely due to their inefficiency, but also largely due to the fact that coming in and the financials they used to come in were very much different from what was on ground, and this did not allow for them to be able to make investments. So I think the private sector and renewable energy side should be able to pick a lot of lessons learned from what happened in that space. Then you look at things like the regulatory and policy and challenges. So I think just to write on what Chibukem had said, when we talk about the regulatory and policy side, implementation is key. And why I'll say this is you have today the regulator has asked for 30 and 50%, 5% of in addition of the disco's vested capacities to basically be procured from renewable energy sources. So I think my question would be what was driving that that regulation in terms of there's some numbers that have been run to see that in the next 1 year, because basically that number comes to about 200 megawatts in total. Do we have renewable energy pipeline projects that in the next 1 year can deliver on that obligation that has now been put on the distribution companies? I think it's a fantastic initiative, being that you're mandating them to take regardless of whatever quantity. But the question is, did we check what we have on the ground to be sure that it can meet what had been put in there? And because we'll definitely be having to look at some interesting initiatives to bring this forward, because you have to maybe the likes of virtual power plants to be able to get bringing in other participants who can come in and aggregate excess capacity from different areas to be able to kind of give it to the grid. So I think in terms of that regulatory part of things, we really need to think about how we focus on marrying not just the regulation but also the implementation. It's very important. And then lastly, I'll touch on the infrastructure deficit. And why I think this is very important as well and has been an issue is we are now in the age of interconnected mini grids. You have more interconnected mini grids coming up this year than we probably had in the last 5 years. But as an interconnected mini grid, what this means is you have made plans to supply, say, 10 hours of supply, and the distribution or the distribution company is supposed to supply the remaining 14 hours. So This means you have agreed to certain service levels and have gone to your offtake or your customer and you made certain promises and signed on that backing that you will be able to give them 24 hours of supply based on your 10 hours and your 14 hours from the distribution company. But today, due to our compounding infrastructure deficit, you have maybe the distribution company not being able to meet that obligation. And sometimes you may even go a couple of days without them being able to provide that supply. And unfortunately, you had already signed a service level agreement, and that service level agreement, is binding. That it may have, financial repercussions for you because there may have to be some rebates that should be given back to the customer. So I think these are, key constraints that the private sector, faces in trying to implement projects in the renewable energy space. So if we're able to work around this, we should be able to basically get to a better standpoint. Thank
I
you.
think I agree with you, Nadozie, a lot, especially when you spoke about the interconnected mini grid and how the discos are not able to meet their supplies. But I think to round wrap this into a very good way that I'll go to you, Chibuikem, because I am thinking that having an interconnected mini grid where the disco is not really, pressured to supply a certain amount of energy. Maybe in the long run, they become the backup, might be a good way to, relate with that interconnected mini grid scenario. But then, in the light of this fact, and knowing that there's so much that we can do with renewable energy, and the kind of structures that we can form to ensure adoption in this RE landscape, I would like to hear from you, Chibuikem, what you propose, will be the right ones to adopt, and what value do they also bring to the table for our, communities and off-takers. Chibuikem.
Yeah, I think I lost you for a few seconds. Yeah, can you still hear me?
Yes. I hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so you're asking what value the interconnected mini grids bring.
Yeah, I'm saying that generally, if you look at the different kinds of structure, am I the one struggling, or is it from only Chibuikem? Can everybody else hear?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, Chibuikem, I think your internet is now dicey, but I can see that your face is moving now, so I believe you will hear me now. Okay, so I was saying that, considering interconnected mini grid and every other structure of, deploying access to renewable energy for us across Africa, what other, RE solutions or structures can you propose? And what value do you think they will bring to the communities who use these technologies? Oh, it's like he's frozen again. Chibuikem, are you still frozen? Okay, so I'll go on to Najim, and I was hoping that Chibuikem, if we had heard him well, he would have spoken to a number of RE technologies and the value they bring to the communities. For me, I would say one of the main things, and I think that's what my dissertation is on, is how it improves upon the job creation, economic empowerment of people. But then you also always think, how will the economy, like the enabling environment always look like, and so all of us, if you're in business in Nigeria or you related to somebody who is doing business, you always have this problem that how do we manage with one thing or the other? And of course, we've spoken a bit about it, and even Nadozie mentioned it in some of his slides. But I would like to hear from you, Najim, with all this that we hear about enabling the environment and how it can aid the adoption of growth of the sector. How can the government help? And when I speak about this, I'm being very particular, because how can the government really help, and add to this, your own ideas of policy regulations that could be improved upon to accelerate the growth of RE in Africa? I repeat again, how can the government help? Because there are so many places that it's as if they put a noose around your neck if you're a private sector player.
Government is a major catalyst for creating the enabling environment for RE to take root. And Dozier has done a wonderful job of opening up the world of RE policy development and evolution in Africa. He's done a really good job of it. And I want to just focus, just to give you an example, I just want to focus on three countries in Africa, on Morocco, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And now Morocco, the point I'm trying to make with my analysis here is to show you that the link between policy and outcomes is actually is integral to any policy working out. And our policies, as a general rule in Nigeria, are not necessarily linked to outcomes. They tend to be linked more to outputs, right? So we have a lot of projects that come out of a particular policy, but the policy was designed for the project rather than to solve the problem at hand. Now, what do I mean by that? Dozier mentioned Morocco and the Ouarzazate project. I have quite intimate knowledge of that project in that the founding members of Mazen, the company that sponsored the first Ouarzazate project, are partners in my solar company in Morocco. My company is headquartered in Morocco. So to understand how Morocco became a leader in renewable energy, you have to understand the problem they were trying to solve. And the problem they were trying to solve was this. They needed to diversify their energy because they didn't want to be dependent upon fossil fuels when there is another crisis. And this started after 9/11 and the prices of oil went up. So they needed to solve a problem. And the problem that they wanted to solve was, we're not an oil-producing country, but we need to have an independent energy source. What energy do we have? That's when they started to now discuss their renewable energy options. When it wasn't fashionable for other people to start developing renewable energy, the Moroccans were already looking at it. Then they now developed their green paper, their white paper. They now created a policy document that allowed them to establish Mazen, which at the time was called the Moroccan Agency for Solar Energy. So this was a parastatal developed to develop the Ouarzazate complex. And the first project was the 150 megawatt Ouarzazate CSP project. After that, they now decided to develop on that same piece of land, right? Or in that area, approximately, I think it's about 3,000 megawatts, which is where you get the $9 billion from. And so they've developed this technology to the point where they are now exporting the energy to the United Kingdom. There's a 3,000 kilometer underwater line from northern Morocco to supply power to the west of England. But this all came about from a need. They saw a problem and they made it a policy for a particular outcome, which was energy independence. Now, in addition to that, the king, who was a new king at the time, started to improve Morocco's infrastructure. And so what they did with Mazen was the government de-risked the project because they wanted to achieve a policy outcome. So the government bought the land, did all the studies, prepared the PPA, and then auctioned it out to everybody. And so the private sector came in when the project was de-risked. Now, what the government also did at the time, the Moroccan government did, which was very clever, was they went to the World Bank and had the World Bank lend them money, the government money, to develop these projects. So the government now did three things with Mazen. The government was a project developer. The government was the senior lender, right? The government was also a shareholder in the project company. So it had a commercial role, it had a regulatory role, it had an investment role, and it had a lending role. That's what the government did in Morocco, right? Now, that was so successful that IFC, Scaling Solar, decided to do that on an international scale. So when you see Scaling Solar, it is a Mazen model, right, that was developed and hawked off the country. Now, the problem with the Scaling Solar is that you'll get a good project, but can you replicate it? Now, I don't know any country that has done Scaling Solar that has been able to replicate that project in that country. But I know the Moroccans with Mazen have been able to do it. Now, the Egyptians now took Mazen's model and turned it into an Egyptian version, right? They too got all the projects in one place and they auctioned off some of the project sites. But what the Egyptians did, which Moroccans didn't do, was they required the PPA to be in local Egyptian pounds, right? And what they then did was they ensured that their local pension funds could now buy out some of the interests of the exiting developers who didn't want their income to be in local currency, but wanted to make the margins on the development success fee. Again, they had specific outcomes they wanted to achieve, and they tailored their policies to achieve those outcomes. Now, the question for us in Nigeria is, have we designed the policies that we want for the outcomes that we need? Or are we designing policies for outputs? The fundamental difference. The outcomes we need, right, is not just energy access. We need to improve productivity. We need to improve literacy. We need to improve a whole bunch of things that are development indicators that will be the outcomes of any policy that we make. Now, for me, I do not see that on any of the policies, including the Electricity Act that we have. Or I don't see enough of it, right? So when we now want to go back, including the energy transition plan, when we now want to go back, we need to do a foundational assessment of what are we trying to achieve? What do we want to do? Now, for me, what I would like to see is this. We have a fundamental problem, and our big problem is a political problem. And we can't solve it politically because there's very little trust in Nigeria. And that problem is a subsidy problem. We have subsidies on our currency, we have subsidies on our electricity, and we have subsidies on our petroleum. And nobody wants to give them up because they don't trust the government. Simple. That's the fundamental equation we have in Nigeria. Now, how do we solve that problem? Well, when you look around at many of the policies that we are trying to emulate, the question is, does it solve that problem for us? The renewable energy can solve that problem for us in many ways. Why? Because 96% of our businesses are small-scale businesses, right? Most of those businesses power their businesses using either diesel or petrol. And most of them use petrol because diesel is so expensive. So the petrol that is being used, which is being subsidized, is a function of the warped incentive structures that we have in Nigeria, because that subsidy on petrol means we don't have infrastructure and we don't have very good healthcare. So when you're asking me, where does renewables fit in? I'm saying that, well, the fundamental question you want to ask is, what problem are you solving for? Once you solve for that problem, there is no limit to the demand for renewable energy that you will find. But if you try to create an incentive structure, right, that is measured by the number of projects and the number of that you're doing that require subsidies to make them work, then that becomes a problem. So the stability of the regulatory regime, all of those things are very important. They're critically important. But the linkages and the dependencies between the policies and the outcomes are, for me, far more important. And that nexus is what I just have not been able to figure out in Nigeria. Now, they figured it out in Morocco. They figured it out in Egypt. Better than Egypt and Morocco, they figured it out in Ethiopia. They have a grid expansion plan in Ethiopia that has a target for next year, 25% for next year. They're going to give complete energy access. And it's a 65-35% split. 65% is going to be grid expansion and the supply of electricity based upon the grid to 65% of their population, and mostly for the economic sectors, big industries. 35% is essentially off-grid or grid-enabled. Now, in Nigeria, we're not even close to that, right? Because we're not at the point where we can actually start dealing with all of these grid-enabled or grid access projects, big projects. I say that as somebody who's one of the 14 solar IPP developers. I've been developing this project for almost 10 years, so I kind of know the terrain really, really well, the legal and regulatory terrain, and I cannot see a way where 100 megawatts of solar can be injected onto the grid as it is. Dozier can correct me if I'm wrong, but I cannot see a way where it can be injected onto the grid. And even if I were to inject 30 megawatts onto the distribution grid, I find it might be difficult to inject that onto the grid without providing an enormous amount of support and enormous amount of enhancements to ensure that I have a credit-worthy off-taker. Now, if you have to do all of that, that tells you that you have to subsidize it. And if you have to subsidize it, it's not viable.
Well,
so the problem you have to solve for first is, what's your problem? And what outcomes are you hoping to achieve? Once you get that sorted out, your policies will flow. Because the linkages and dependencies that are required to make that policy work are conditions precedents for you to have the policy in the first place.
I hear you very well, Najim, that designing policies for outcomes actually is what we've been doing, and we need to improve upon that. And I think one of the things that I really liked from here, listening to you, is what they did in Morocco by, understanding that what they need to solve for is the problem, and designing a policy that suited it, and where they were the lenders, the bankers basically of the project. I think that worked. And maybe not just Nigeria, a lot more of African countries need to actually go there and learn a bit more. Chibukem, I'm hoping that you're here with us now, because I see we have only 14 minutes to go. But one of the questions I had for you was that, in the light of the fact that renewable energy is vast, which ones would you propose for the African landscape? And I was trying to lean it on the fact that, there's been several structures of renewable energy deployments that have been, tried. So which ones, for me, if I'm trying to ask, okay, would you believe in the interconnected mini grids, off-grid mini grids, or any other one that you think will work, and the kind of value they will bring to the people that these technologies were designed for?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm sorry. I think my internet just went off at that time. So I'll try and quickly answer this question.
Totally understand.
Limited time joining, but I think for me it's based on two things. One is the least cost electrification approach. So which one is least cost and which one works. Secondly, if you're looking like having an integrated resource plan, so looking at what the commercial viability, the energy resource in the area, the level of infrastructure development, the economics of it, and then utilizing the least cost benefit approach, identifying which solutions work best. So I'm not really particular in terms. I'm more agnostic when it comes to the resource, as long as it's clean and it's sustainable. But then, as long as the resource and the economics make sense, which would differ via region and via country as well. So I think really, just to quickly answer that question, is really identify what's the core energy mix there in terms of renewables, which one is most advanced in terms of technology and can be deployed, looking at the economics, what the energy mix would be, the least cost approach, and identifying which solution works best.
So Najim was talking earlier, and he said he didn't believe in I don't know if that, not in so many words, but he was a bit against subsidies. And I was thinking, I'm like, oh my God, no, subsidies actually brought us to this kind of adoption level that we're currently seeing in Africa. In Nigeria, for example. 1 minute, Najim, I can see you raising your hands. But what I really wanted to hear was, what kind of business models do we want to, talk about here that will work? Because I believe in the fact that if electricity had been subsidized for all these years, and currently we're trying to, go into renewables, I think subsidies has a role to play. Maybe, Najim, you want to go a bit before Chibukem answers that?
Yeah, the issue of subsidy is not that subsidies are bad, right? Subsidies to encourage investments are good. Yeah, which is what you're talking about. If you want a subsidy to encourage investments so that you lower the cost of capital, which is what we're trying to do, that's good. Okay. For us, the ideal is to be able to actually invest in Naira, so we don't have the foreign exchange risk that is so punitive to us when we borrow money.
Okay.
So that's a big problem for us, yeah?
Yeah, I understand. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were done.
Policy you need to design is around that, not around consumption, where you subsidize the consumption of electricity, you subsidize the currency exchanges, and you subsidize petroleum. that is not a productive subsidy.
We are subsidizing.
Productive subsidies is fine. The problem, though, is even with the productive subsidy, you have to target it, right? So all the stuff that Dodier was talking about, tax-free holidays, investment tax credits, withholding tax, those are subsidies. The other subsidies you could do, in addition to reducing the cost of capital, is to take advantage of subsidies that other people have done. So, for example, right now, the Chinese have subsidized everybody's energy transition by crashing the price of solar and crashing the price of batteries, right? We should take advantage of that. We should also take advantage, and if we're smart, the government will do that. We will take advantage of what the Chinese have just done, which is to create a $5 billion fund, which is basically a slush fund for anybody who has a serious policy to develop renewable energy that can offtake all this excess capacity of solar off them. They've created a $5 billion fund that you can go through SIDCA, the Chinese Development Agency, to go to the Chinese Development Bank, right, with a private sector financier to develop projects like your project, right? And they'll give you up to concessional loans for up to 20 years, up to 50 years, which is free money. At 3%, 2%, it's free money. It's literally free money. So yeah, I'm all for that, right? But I'm not for paying, right, $600, right, for a connection.
Right? Well, I think
let me tell you why I'm not for that, right? I'm not for a connection subsidy of $600 to enable the developer to develop a renewable energy project. Why? Because you don't even know if the person you're subscribing to can actually afford the electricity. The second reason is it encourages developers like me to just build the plant and not worry about anything else. So I don't solve the problem. I get an output, connection, but I have not got an outcome, increased productivity.
Well, Najim, I would like to just stop you there and assume that is also your parting input. And I'll ask if there's any questions or, for the team here before I allow them to give us their final input. I had chatted in the group if there was any, but I got the feedback there was none. Is there any questions and answers, Chikamara? Questions that need answers, sorry. Okay, so one question just came in. So there's a question, how can climate finance be effectively mobilized to support renewable energy projects in rural and undeserved areas? I think that question is out to, Chibukem, do you want to take a shot at this?
Yeah, sure. I can try. So I think, you're looking at climate finance from two sources, from the public source, from the government, and from the private sector source as well. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes. So just to answer that question, I'm looking at climate finance from two sources, from the public source and from the private sector source, really. And just quickly, I think it's really with regards to how can we use public finance, for example, to incentivize and to unlock or catalyze private sector finance and climate financing. So, climate finance is basically just infrastructure finance, but focused on climate outcomes. And so in Nigeria, for example, where you have funds for like DFIs, the subsidies by the World Bank, for example, or the green bonds that have been raised, those sort of instruments that are developed to incentivize or to attract additional private sector financing. And so I think it's really just looking at how we can utilize public finance. It could be from pension funds. It could be also in terms of guarantees or loan instruments, green bonds, to attract more private sector financing for the space. That is one of the quickest I think we can use to draw in private sector finance, in addition to other things like improving the enabling environment, amongst others.
Okay, thank you so much, Chibukem. And I'll use this opportunity to suggest to everyone listening that you can actually post your questions in the chat, in the YouTube link where you're watching from. So kindly feel free to post questions on the YouTube chat. And I'll go on to Nadozie and directly ask you, as you give us your final inputs. Maybe you can lean it towards the business models that private sectors can actually adopt to ensure adoption and quick adoption of APRI solutions.
Okay, thank you, Abiba. So I think in terms of closing remarks and business models, I think from everything we've discussed and seen, we can see that the private sector is rightly poised to drive further renewable energy growth and integration by bringing in much more investments, and like Najim had also said, hopefully come from the problem solving angle in terms of now working together to design policies and regulations, not just for the project outcome, but also to solve actual problems. And I think private sector also has the ability to think of some innovative ways in terms of business models which they can use to continue to drive the RE sector. And I think a key one would be looking at the likes of renewable energy cooperatives and also community-owned renewable energy projects. And what I mean by that, I think this has been implemented, in the US and
Just
the US, in
full
Germany, in India.
disclosure dossier. You need to make full disclosure.
Oh no! I'm not even speaking.
Oh.
Not no.
We have just 3 minutes, so if you can wrap that up, Mr. Nadozie, so that we can.
Okay. So I think globally we've seen cooperatives and community-owned renewable energy projects going on. So this is where the community either is having a stake in terms of sometimes even full ownership of the entire project. I think why this would be a full key driver that would eventually help also kind of would I say wind down subsidies like Najim is not exactly for in terms of in that way, because what you're finding now is with the community having an ownership stake in projects like this, you're things like there's a better governance structure. You're able to better implement the project because now they're not just we've moved from them just being consumers to them being consumers, prosumers, and owners in terms of so they're just not just that they are consuming and producing, but depending on the size of that plant, they're also able to go ahead and supply to other areas. And I think we've seen it's happened in so many countries in the US, in Australia, in India. It's coming to Nigeria. And I think it's just something to think about in terms of how to, the private sector can continue to drive such initiatives. So it's fantastic.
Thank you very much. I think I would, I have one more question from the audience, and I think they are very key. I'm sorry, but anything else would have to, maybe you communicate with the organizers and get the speakers to talk to it. But I have 1 minute to ask, how can stakeholder engagement be improved to ensure the success of renewable energy projects in rural areas? I will quickly go on to this and say, there are so many ways you have to carry out, stakeholder engagements. I think in that dossier even touched on a bit, talking about stakeholders in the communities being the prosumers, the consumers, and producers of their own energy. I think basically energy democracy is what you're talking about, and there are several routes to having these stakeholder consultations happen in these communities. You can reach out to us maybe after this call to learn more, because I have 1 more minute to say. Let me thank the panel for this very engaging and insightful. We didn't have time enough at all because it was just beginning to get interesting, and time is saying get out. So this very engaging and insightful conversation. I hope our audiences have enjoyed it as much as I did. It was truly, truly inspiring. I would like to thank APRI and their team for organizing this program and bringing together such brilliant minds to discuss Africa's renewable energy potential and the role of the private sector. We hope our discussion today will lead to tangible strategic outcomes and opportunities for our people. Thank you very much. Now.